There are moments in motherhood that feel so ordinary you barely even register them. Walking to the park, taking the dog out, going outside because everyone has too much energy and you just need to get out of the house for an hour. Those little routines become the background noise of family life. They're not moments you think will matter years from now because at the time they're just another day. But as every parent knows, even if we don't say it out loud, our entire world is built around the assumption that tomorrow will look like today, that we'll wake up, make breakfast, find the missing shoe, answer the same toddler questions for the 100th time, and do it all again. But sometimes the scariest thing about life is that the moments we assume are safe are the ones that can change everything. On July 15th, 1992, a young mother did something thousands of parents do every day. She took her young son outside for a walk. She brought along their family dog and went somewhere familiar, somewhere peaceful, somewhere she had no reason to believe was unsafe. And then she never came home. And her little boy, just weeks shy of turning 3 years old, became the only witness to what happened. This is the story of Rachel Nickell. Welcome to True Crime After Bedtime, where we swap the sippy cups for something a little stronger, and the stories get a lot darker. Tonight we head to London, England, July 15th, 1992, a beautiful summer morning on Wimbledon Common. If you're here because you just watched the Netflix documentary The Witness, welcome. And if you haven't watched it yet, I strongly recommend it. But while I was researching this episode, I found myself thinking just as much about Rachel's life before July 15th as I did about the investigation. The documentary does a lot of work covering what went wrong, and for a good reason, because a lot went wrong. But before we get into all of that, I want to spend some time talking about the person at the center of the story. Because one thing I've noticed while researching true crime is that victims can sometimes disappear behind the investigation. Their name becomes attached to a case, a headline, or a documentary, and we forget that before any of that happened, they were a person with a life. Rachel Nickell was a young woman who was raising a son, building a family, and making plans for the future. She was not a case file. She was not a headline. She was a mother who woke up one morning and expected to come home. Rachel Jane Nickell was born on November 23, 1968, in Essex, England. She grew up in a village called Great Totham, attended a girls' grammar school, volunteered with elderly people, worked with children with disabilities. She studied English and history. She trained as a dancer. She was described by the people who knew her as kind, outgoing, independent, and full of life. In 1988, she was working as a lifeguard at a pool in Richmond when she met a motorcycle courier named Andre Hanscom. She called her mom after their very first date and told her she just met the man she was going to spend the rest of her life with. Rachel and Andre had a son together, Alexander Louis Hanscom, born in 1989. They called him Alex. They lived together in Balham, South London. Money was tight. They were young, but by all accounts, they were happy. Andre later described the three of them, along with their dog Molly, as Rachel's little pack. They were a family. They had big dreams of eventually leaving London and settling somewhere quiet in the French countryside. Rachel was not just someone who was killed. She was someone who had a future that she expected to live. On the morning of July 15, 1992, Andre got on his motorcycle and headed to work. He later recalled Rachel and Alex waving to him from their apartment window as he pulled away. Then, Rachel took Alex and their dog Molly for a walk on Wimbledon Common. Wimbledon Common is a large stretch of open parkland in southwest London. Families walked there, people ran there, dogs were everywhere. It was the kind of place you'd bring a toddler on a summer morning without a second thought. It was familiar territory for Rachel. This was not a place she was visiting for the first time. It was part of her normal routine. And I think that's one of the most unsettling parts of this case. It wasn't a situation where someone knowingly walked into danger. Rachel wasn't somewhere she shouldn't have been. She was being a mom. She was taking her toddler outside. She was walking the family dog. She was having what should have been an ordinary morning. At some point during that walk, Rachel was attacked, assaulted, and murdered. The attack was witnessed by Alex. And that detail is what would make this case unlike almost any other. Because investigators were not just trying to solve a murder, they were trying to understand what happened through the eyes of a child who was not even 3 years old. Alex Hanscom was 2 years and 11 months old when his mother was killed. Children at that stage are only just beginning to form long-term memories, but they often do not yet have the language or emotional understanding to explain complex events. Anyone who spent time around toddlers understands this. A child can remember the smallest details about something that happened months ago, but then will struggle to answer a simple question about what happened 5 minutes before. Their memories are real, but they are experienced differently. When police arrived, they were faced with a situation that would challenge even the most experienced investigators. Alex was the only known witness to what happened to Rachel, but he was also a very young child who had experienced something no child should ever have to experience. Years later, Alex publicly spoke about what he actually remembers from that morning. He said they could sense something in the air before it happened. He and Rachel turned their heads and saw, in his words, a stranger lurching towards us with a black bag over his shoulders. He was grabbed and thrown roughly to the ground. His face was dragged through the mud. And then, in the seconds after, he reached out to his mother and asked her to get up. I realized in a split second, he said, that she'd gone and was never coming back. He was 2 years and 11 months old. What stands out to me about this is not just the tragedy of what happened, but the way children try to process things they can't fully understand. They use the tools they have, a story they were read, a movie they watched, a memory, a familiar idea, and somehow they try to make sense of something that even adults struggle to comprehend. Police had to carefully consider what Alex could understand, what he could communicate, and how to avoid influencing his memory. Because young children can be incredibly perceptive, but they also experience and describe events differently from adults. The information Alex provided would become an important part of the investigation, but it would also be one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire case, because behind the evidence was a little boy who had lost his mother. The murder of Rachel Nickell became a national story almost immediately. A young mother, a toddler, a public park, broad daylight. The UK was horrified, and the Metropolitan Police were under enormous pressure to find the person responsible and fast. And when there is pressure to solve a case quickly, mistakes can happen. The biggest problem here was that they had almost nothing to work with. Forensic technology in 1992 was not what it is now. The tiny traces of biological material recovered from the scene were too small for the DNA testing that existed at the time. After a full month of investigation, police couldn't even definitely confirm whether the killer was male or female. They had limited physical evidence, limited forensics, and one witness who was not even 3 years old. I want to pause here and explain something because I think it's important context for everything that follows. When we talk about DNA evidence and forensic timelines in true crime, it's easy to forget that science has changed dramatically in 30 years. What we now consider basic forensic analysis, the kind of DNA matching that takes days, didn't exist in the way we understand it now in 1992. Investigators weren't holding back. They genuinely could not process what they had. And that gap between what they had and what they need is what drove every subsequent decision in this case. Some of those decisions were understandable. Some of them were not. Desperate for a lead, investigators brought in a criminal psychologist named Paul Britton for assistance in developing a profile of the possible offender. The profile suggested the killer was likely a socially isolated man in his 20s or 30s, living near Wimbledon Common, with interest in the occult, knives, and violent sexual fantasies. And I want to be clear about something here. Criminal profiles are investigative tools, not scientific tests. A profile can help narrow a search, but it cannot tell you who committed a crime. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next. The profile and a police sketch were put out in a national television appeal. Several callers identified a local man who walked his dog on the common regularly. His name was Colin Stagg. And this is where the investigation takes a dramatic turn, because Colin Stagg would become one of the most recognizable suspects in British true crime history. But there was one major problem. At the time police focused on him, they did not have physical evidence linking him to Rachel's murder. And that would become the central question surrounding this case. Did investigators follow the evidence to Colin Stagg? Or did they decide Colin Stagg was their suspect and then search for evidence to support that belief? Colin Stagg was 29 years old. He lived near Wimbledon Common. He walked his dog there regularly. He was single, socially isolated. He had responded to a Lonely Hearts advertisement in a magazine, and his letters were noted by investigators. He had an interest in paganism. He owned knives. And altogether, those factors convinced investigators to focus on him as their primary suspect. None of those things were evidence of murder, but that's the point. And this is one of the most important lessons from the case. A profile is not proof. A person can share certain characteristics with a hypothetical offender and still be completely innocent. There was no DNA evidence linking him to Rachel's murder. No forensic evidence. No witness who identified him. No confession. I'll state it again. Profiling can be a useful investigative tool. It can help detectives think about possibilities, narrow a pool of suspects, prioritize leads, but a profile is not evidence. The problem is that once investigators begin to believe they have the right person, every piece of information can start being interpreted through that lens. Evidence that supports the theory feels important. Evidence that contradicts the theory can be overlooked. This is known as tunnel vision, and the Rachel Nickell investigation would become one of the most famous examples of how dangerous it can be. At this point, Colin Stagg had not been arrested. Police simply believed he was their man, and what came next was their attempt to prove it. Before we get to Operation Edsel, I want to spend a minute here, because if you're watching this thinking, how did this happen? How did trained detectives spend years pursuing someone they had no evidence against? I think it's worth understanding the conditions that made it possible. 3 things were working against this investigation from the start. The first is tunnel vision. Once investigators decided Colin Stagg matched the profile, they stopped looking for alternatives. Every new piece of information was filtered through that belief. And that's not unique to this case. It's a well-documented failure mode in major investigations, and it has happened in cases all over the world. The second is confirmation bias, closely related to tunnel vision, but slightly different. It's the tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what you already believe. The undercover operation you're about to hear about is a near-perfect example of confirmation bias in action. Investigators designed a situation intended to produce evidence of guilt, not to objectively test whether guilt existed. The third is pressure. The public wanted answers. The press wanted answers. Rachel's family wanted answers. And that pressure, which is legitimate, understandable, human, can push an investigation to move faster than the evidence warrants, faster than is safe. Understanding these 3 things doesn't excuse what happened, but it does explain how good people working a genuinely difficult case can end up doing something that looks, in hindsight, completely inexplicable. Because police believed Colin Stagg was responsible, they began searching for a way to obtain stronger evidence against him. The challenge they faced was that they believed they knew who had committed the crime, but they did not have enough evidence to prove it. The solution they came up with was an undercover operation, codenamed Operation Edsel. The idea was relatively straightforward. Create a situation where Colin Stagg might reveal information about himself or admit involvement in Rachel's murder. To do this, police used an undercover officer who presented herself as a woman named Lizzie James. The hope was that if Colin was responsible for Rachel's murder, he might eventually reveal the truth. But the operation would later become one of the most controversial parts of this entire case, because instead of simply observing Colin or gathering information, the undercover officer actively engaged with him in an attempt to encourage him to open up. And that raised a major ethical question. At what point does an undercover operation stop uncovering evidence and start creating a situation where someone says something they otherwise would not have said? That question would eventually be debated in court. Investigators believed they were trying to uncover the truth, but critics argued that they were essentially trying to create evidence against someone they already suspected. And those are 2 very different things. Here's what actually happened. The undercover officer spent months communicating with Colin Stagg. She wrote letters to him, spoke with him, and developed what appeared to be a romantic connection. The police hoped this emotional relationship would lower Colin's guard. The operation went further than most people realize. The undercover officer claimed to have committed a murder herself. She also claimed to have participated in satanic rituals, details that investigators believed would appeal to Stagg if he matched the psychological profile they had built. This was a formal Metropolitan Police operation. Approved, designed, executed. During their conversations, the undercover officer was instructed to steer conversations toward violent fantasies, to encourage him to share dark thoughts, to essentially create the conditions under which a guilty person might confess, but also, critically, the conditions under which an innocent person might say things that could be taken out of context. The operation became known in the media as the honey trap. The term refers to using romantic or emotional attraction as a way to obtain information. At one point during the operation, the officer said to Stagg, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder. If only you had killed her. It would be all right." His response was, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't." He never confessed. Not once. In fact, when she pushed, he pushed back. He told her he lived a quiet life. Police argued that they were attempting to understand Colin's true nature. The defense argued that the conversations were being deliberately manipulated. Their argument was that Colin was responding to the situation that had been created around him, rather than revealing something genuine about himself. And this distinction became the heart of the controversy. Because the question was not simply, did Colin say these things? The question was, why did he say them? Was it because he was revealing something about a crime he committed? Or was it because an undercover officer had spent months building a relationship designed to lead him into those conversations? Colin Stagg was arrested in 1993 and charged with Rachel Nickell's murder. The case attracted enormous media attention. Colin's name and photograph appeared across newspapers, and many people had already formed an opinion about him. But behind the headlines, the prosecution's case depended heavily on the evidence obtained through Operation Etzel, and that evidence would soon come under intense scrutiny. The defense argued that the undercover operation amounted to entrapment. They argued that police had not discovered evidence of guilt, but had instead created a situation designed to produce incriminating statements. The case eventually reached the Old Bailey Court in September 1994, and the judge agreed. The evidence obtained through the undercover operation was ruled inadmissible. Mr. Justice Ognall ruled the police had shown excessive zeal and had tried to incriminate their suspect by deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. The operation was described as wholly reprehensible. Without that evidence, the prosecution's case against Stagg collapsed. The charges against him were dropped. Colin Stagg was released. And suddenly, instead of solving a murder case, police were left back at the beginning. Rachel Nickell's killer was still out there, and an innocent man had spent years as the face of one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations. His name had been publicly connected to Rachel's death, and even after he was cleared in court, clearing his reputation would prove much more complicated. This is the part of the story that I think is often overlooked. We talk about wrongful accusations in true crime in this kind of detached, procedural way. Wrongful suspect, flawed investigation, dismissed charges, but behind those words are real people. Colin Stagg's life was destroyed. Even after the charges were dropped, his name never fully recovered. The police had already decided. The papers had already run the headlines. And clearing your name after something like that isn't just a press release. It's years of people looking at you differently, crossing the street, assuming. He later had a breakdown. In 1995, while he was on Wimbledon Common, yes, the same park, he pulled an axe on someone during an altercation. His attorney said at the time, his life, in short, was a complete and utter misery. He lost his sense of reality. He was eventually awarded more than 700,000 euros, which is equivalent to nearly $1.2 million, in compensation for the wrongful arrest and prosecution. Scotland Yard formally apologized to him in 2008 and called him completely innocent of any involvement in the case. But that came 16 years later, after 16 years of living with it. And for Rachel's family, there was a different kind of pain. Because while Colin Stagg was cleared and trying to rebuild his life, Rachel's family was still waiting for answers. The questions still remained the same. Who killed Rachel Nickell? For years, Rachel Nickell's murder sat unresolved. Investigators had exhausted their strongest lead. The case against Colin Stagg had collapsed in a spectacular fashion, and public confidence in the investigation had been badly damaged. Rachel's family was left without answers, while the man responsible had never even been charged. What changed wasn't a surprise witness or a dramatic confession. It was time. More specifically, it was science. When Rachel was killed in 1992, detectives recovered forensic material from her body. Investigators knew it might be important, but the DNA technology available at the time simply wasn't sensitive enough to develop a usable profile from such a tiny sample. Rather than discarding that evidence, it was preserved. Years later, as forensic science improved, detectives reopened the case and asked whether modern techniques could reveal something that had been impossible to see in 1992. A formal cold case review began in the early 2000s. Scientists were finally able to generate a DNA profile from material collected during the original investigation. In 2004, that profile pointed investigators toward a man who, by then, was already serving an indefinite hospital order at Broadmoor High Security Hospital. And this wasn't just a new suspect. It was someone whose name, in hindsight, should have sounded painfully familiar. This is the part of the case that I think is one of the most important and most devastating, and it's the part that gets the least airtime. In November 1993, 16 months after Rachel Nickell's murder, a 28-year-old single mother named Samantha Bissett was murdered in her apartment in Plumstead, southeast London. Her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine, was also killed. The crime scene was so extreme that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. Fingerprints were recovered from the scene, and police already had those fingerprints on file. The man responsible was identified quickly. His name was Robert Napper. Detectives investigating the Bissett murders looked at Rachel Nickell's case. They saw the similarities. They formally raised the possibility that the same person was responsible for both crimes. And according to the later Independent Police Complaints Commission review, the team investigating Rachel's murder, the team that already had Stagg in custody and had stopped looking for other suspects, rejected that suggestion with hostility. Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett in 1995 on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In English law, diminished responsibility is a partial defense to murder. It doesn't mean the person didn't commit the crime. It means the court accepted that, because of a recognized mental disorder, their responsibility was substantially impaired at the time of the offense. In Napper's case, psychiatric experts agreed that he was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia, and the prosecution accepted the plea after reviewing the medical evidence alongside the forensic evidence. One of the hardest parts of researching this case is realizing that Napper wasn't an unknown figure that appeared out of nowhere in 2008. According to the later Independent Police Complaints Commission's review, Napper had been known to police well before any of these murders. In 1989, his own mother had contacted police and reported that he had confessed to raping a woman on Plumstead Common. Police investigated it and let it drop. He was also linked, though not charged at the time, to a series of sexual assaults known as the Green Chain Rapes, carried out between 1989 and 1992. Police had actually excluded him from that inquiry at one point because he was over 6 feet tall, but witness descriptions of the attacker's height conflicted, and Napper walked with a stoop. The IPCC later concluded that without these errors, Robert Napper could have been off the streets before he killed Rachel Nickell, and before Samantha and Jasmine Bissett were murdered. Senior Metropolitan Police officials publicly acknowledged that significant investigative failures had allowed Napper to remain free, and apologized to Rachel's family and to Colin Stagg. While the headlines focused on police failures and DNA evidence, Andre Hanscom was doing something much quieter. He was raising his son. Years later, Andre spoke about how losing Rachel changed even the smallest parts of parenting. Decisions that couples usually make together suddenly became decisions he had to make alone. He has described constantly wondering what Rachel would have wanted for Alex, whether it was something as ordinary as school, routines, or the countless little choices that parents make every week. As parents, we often think the biggest moments are the ones that define us. Birthdays, first steps, the first day of school. But when you actually become a parent, you realize your life is mostly made up of tiny decisions that nobody else notices. And suddenly, reading through Andre's interviews, you realize grief lives in those tiny moments too. Not just in anniversaries, not just in birthdays, but in deciding what story to read at bedtime, in wondering whether Rachel would have laughed at something Alex said, in all of the ordinary moments she should have been there for. Andre raised Alex alone in London for 5 months before the media attention became completely unsupportable. Reporters were following Alex to nursery school, and it wasn't just the press. Alex later described their home as being rigged with cameras and recording equipment so that investigators could hear anything he might say about what had happened. A grieving toddler being monitored in his own home. Andre packed up their lives and moved to France, and they later settled in Spain. Alex grew up in Europe, away from British press. He had severe nightmares for years. Andre described him as sometimes going into a catatonic state from the trauma. Alex has since written a memoir called Letting Go, a true story of murder, loss, and survival. He has spoken publicly about that morning and what he remembers. In 2007, detectives traveled to Broadmoor Hospital and arrested Robert Napper for the murder of Rachel Nickell. In December 2008, 16 years and 5 months after Rachel walked out of her home in Balham with Alex and Molly, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to her manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The court heard from psychiatrists who agreed that he had paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the killing. He was also found to have Asperger's syndrome, though it's worth noting that the schizophrenia was the diagnosis relevant to the diminished responsibility plea and not the Asperger's diagnosis. Justice Griffiths-William told him, "You are, on any view, a very dangerous man." He ordered Napper to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor. He remains there today. Even though Rachel's killer was eventually identified, the case never became a simple story of justice served, because there are things you just can't unknow. Looking back, there were opportunities where information about Robert Napper might have been connected sooner. He was in the system. His mother had called the police on him. Detectives from another murder had tried to flag him, and none of it connected in time to save her. Colin Stagg had his life taken apart for a crime he did not commit, while the actual perpetrator committed at least 2 more murders. And somewhere in Spain, there's a man named Andre and his son Alex, who was almost 2 years old the last time he saw his mom alive, and who spent his entire life carrying something no child should ever have to carry. Alex told The Guardian, "I remember the particular moment I knew she was gone. That feeling of losing someone you love, how everything can change in a matter of seconds." When I first started researching Rachel Nickell's story, I thought this was going to be a case about investigative failures, and it is. I thought it was going to be a story about DNA solving a cold case, and it is. But after reading Andre's interviews and listening to Alex speak about his mom, those are not the things that stick with me. What I'll remember is Rachel, a 23-year-old mom who woke up on a summer morning, got her little boy ready, clipped a leash onto the family dog, and went for a walk that should have ended back at home. She never got to watch Alex grow up. She never got to see the plans that she and Andre had made become a reality. And that's why I always want to start these stories with the victim. Not because it makes the ending sadder, but because it reminds us that before there was a crime, there was a life. I also think about Samantha Bissett a lot in this case. She and Jasmine didn't get the Netflix documentary. They rarely come up in conversation about what went wrong. And they're part of it. They're a huge part of it. Because that wasn't bad luck. That was a system so committed to one answer that it refused to hear another. And that's it for tonight's True Crime After Bedtime. I'll see you on Monday, back to the motherhood chaos. Stay safe out there, and maybe go for a walk with someone you love this week, and notice the ordinary moments. Rachel knew how to find joy in those. Her son said so.